My hope today is to provide a sort of high-level perspective touching on the major themes of today's seminar. I'll provide a brief overview of the current state and nature of cybersecurity, ambitiously in 3 slides. I'll then look into how cybersecurity might fit into the concepts of hybrid threats and resilience and how we might look at this, and then end on some points concerning how we might act on these conclusions, or at least how we might think about solutions. The presentation is a fairly quick, high-level perspective. I'm hoping that it will contribute to an action-packed discussion later. But if there are any specific or possibly technical questions regarding anything I might raise, I'd obviously be happy to answer those then as well. So I think next slide, please. And probably the next. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. I think it's fair to say that 2021 very much exemplified the current state of cybersecurity in public and policy discourse. Even without my spelling this out, I think there's no doubt that the members of today's audience have both seen some of these headlines themselves and have had to confront their implications over the course of their day-to-day work. I can tell you for a fact that from a cybersecurity standpoint, it was very much an exceptionally busy year. This is far from a comprehensive list, but it's just a quick overview highlighting some sort of severe cybersecurity incidents and issues, covering quite a lot of ground. So in cyber espionage, the year began with the fallout from the high-profile compromise of software company SolarWinds, alongside other intrusion vectors in activity that was attributed to Russian actors. This is very much a sort of textbook and technically proficient case of targeted espionage. In a few months after that, we saw the mass exploitation of a vulnerability in the prolifically used Microsoft Exchange Server software, including at some point as a zero-day vulnerability, so prior to its mitigation by developers, by a wide range of malicious actors linked back to China. Ransomware, we all know about. I think the Colonial Pipeline incident was probably the highest profile incident. But overall, ransomware incidents were very much a sort of day-to-day occurrence that impacted, in turn, the day-to-day operation of critical sectors such as healthcare or food provision worldwide over the course of the year. And we'll touch on this later in the presentation as well. And vulnerabilities, I've mostly put this in here because I've had to deal with this for the last few months. But the widely used Log4j logging utility was found to be impacted by a major vulnerability in December. This essentially drove a patching frenzy by industry ahead of anticipated exploitation. When this eventually occurred, it did not happen to the anticipated scale. And it's a good reminder that really decades after cybersecurity first came into existence as a field and in common parlance, it's still very, very difficult to predict how cybersecurity will unfold. There's still many lessons to be learned. Next slide, please. So, meanwhile, only a month into 2022, current geopolitical developments have fueled debates concerning what cybersecurity might look like in the weeks and months to come. So the case in point here is the ongoing Russia-Ukraine standoff. There's already been sort of disruptive activity with suspected links to the standoff. I'm sure everybody here has read about Ukrainian authorities attributing web defacement last month to the threat actor UNC1151, which in turn has been linked back to Belarusian state authorities, according to some researchers, though of course attribution is an incredibly tricky game in this field. But it is accepted at this point that what we have publicly observed to date doesn't really constitute a major exertion of capabilities. What we've seen in the interim is really a lot of disagreement and a lack of clarity surrounding how cybersecurity issues might be manifested within the context of this crisis. So what you see in that first bullet point is actually sort of 2 excerpts drawn from actual recent writing on the topic. So the battlefield advantage comes from Dmitry Alperovich writing in Foreign Affairs. Irrelevant on the battlefield comes from Mashmaya and Kostyuk in War on the Rocks. The latter piece actually makes a fairly strong argument against. They look at 5 instances of disruptive cyber operations in Ukraine linked to Russia from the past decade or so. They categorize 4 as being negligible in strategic value and only 1, not petya, as uncertain in value. So there's clearly a lot of disagreement here, and there are questions besides: what might activity in cyberspace look like as a crisis escalates? What does it look like after the shooting war potentially begins? And when the activity actually happens, will it function as intended? So there's considerable uncertainty and considerable debate, and it's again very much a useful illustration of how at a specialist level there's a lack of clarity concerning how specific scenarios in cyberspace might play out. So state-on-state conflict in cyberspace is really nowhere near as straightforward as simple metaphors might imply. Next slide, please. So there are quite a lot of conclusions to be drawn from all of the above that we certainly do not have time for. So what I'd like to do is propose two potentially controversial perspectives to help inform the remainder of this presentation. The first is the argument that you could consider cybersecurity as a double strategic disappointment. I think it's, on one hand, quite hard to argue that cybersecurity has had the straightforward and potent strategic impact as a straightforward and simply used item in the decision maker's array of options that phraseology such as Cyber Pearl Harbor might imply. You can see that in the sort of disagreements and the questions that I've laid out in the previous slide. On the other hand, cybersecurity has had a clear sort of strategic impact, not necessarily as a set of single-use tools with an immediate strategic impact, but as a complex, global, interrelated ecosystem of issues and incidents that really defy easy categorization and, in turn, responses. This leads me to the second point, which is that in many instances, there's an argument to be made that cybersecurity is really better understood as a complex sort of sociological ecosystem than a coherent and symmetrical warfighting domain. You can illustrate this through a number of examples, and I've laid out a few here. The first sort of looks at the ransomware sort of scourge that we're dealing with right now. From a technical standpoint, ransomware itself first emerged in the late 1980s, and for the most part, the technical tooling itself is not particularly complex. And there's a strong argument to be made that what has driven the current scourge of ransomware is more sort of criminal business models and the emergence of functional underground communities. And so there's a clear challenge here. You can take down individual ransomware actors, but they keep coming back because the tooling is simple, the community is there, the profit incentive continually exists, and so you need to be somewhat more circumspect about how you address these challenges. Looking at sort of what might be more traditionally within the realm of nation-state activity, cyber espionage or sabotage, there isn't always a direct relationship between sort of high-level or executive tasking and effects on target. And in many cases, you will see a sort of complex assemblage of bureaucracies and communities that comprise national threat nexuses. What this can mean is that you can see eventualities such as, say, opportunistic contractors leading to high-profile compromises rather than sort of top-level orders to conduct activity. And finally, sort of cybersecurity issues themselves on the defensive side don't necessarily stem from a symmetrical security landscape, but really, an equally complex ecosystem. So sort of decades of vulnerable software, infrastructure abuse, fragmented service provision, poorly documented supply chains, dependencies, many sort of companies and stakeholders, organizations. So again, on the defensive side, you are working not with a straightforward domain, but decades worth of accumulated assemblages that come together as a sort of ecosystem. So really, rather than anything as straightforward as sort of forced disposition on defined terrain, many sort of case studies and phenomena in cybersecurity reveal themselves to be a sort of complex assemblage of personalities, of bureaucracies, client relationships, financial motives, and so on, with crucial implications for responses to cybersecurity issues. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this brings us cleanly into the next section, I think, where I'll attempt to take what we now know about cybersecurity and fit it against the concept of hybrid threats. So I think nobody will be surprised to see the contention of my first slide, which is cybersecurity relevant to hybrid threats? Inevitably, yes. I think firstly, of course, we need to define hybrid threats. As you can see, this is absolutely not a coherent definition, and I'm very prepared to be sort of torn apart by the experts in the room later. But what I've tried to do is tie together some common characteristics of hybrid threats that can be seen across sort of multiple definitions of the phenomenon. So we're looking at things like a diversity of involved actors, an equal diversity of sort of coordinated actions towards given objectives, the exploitation of what is being called sort of gray zone ambiguity between war and peace, or different interfaces between steps on the escalation ladder, and objectives that really encompass the destabilization, disruption, or really negative influence on target societies, as well as sort of crucial societal infrastructure and decision-making structures. And it doesn't take too much of a leap of the imagination to see sort of how cyberspace provides a sort of fertile, almost ground for that sort of activity. Whether we're talking about disinformation campaigns destabilizing confidence in politics, more direct intrusions with espionage objectives, or disruptive activities such as wiper or ransomware deployment. There are really many ways in which you can see sort of how these two sort of sets of phenomena interface. And it's also very much worth noting that activity in cyberspace, really at its best and most effective, can and should be coordinated across domains and activity categories. So the examples I've laid out here are sort of hack and leak campaigns, where you can blend intrusions with disinformations, you secure data and then leak it selectively, or leak sort of modified information. Maybe disruptive wiper activity, maybe masquerading as ransomware to cover up other operations, and then things such as sort of human and human-enabled access to targets or victims, or maybe sensitive software providers. There are really a whole roster of examples. And of course, taking the cybersecurity as an ecosystem perspective, the diversity of actors is really crucial to creating this condition of hybridity, and is a core phenomenon of cybersecurity as a field, both in terms of malicious actors and their prospective victims. Next slide, please. So this is where the qualifiers come into play. I do want to sort of flesh this out and maybe qualify this to some extent. So firstly, I think really the sort of difference between hybrid warfare and hybrid threats is particularly important for cybersecurity and its relationship with hybrid threats. I think I want to refer back here actually to Mr. Cremitis Courtney's excellent presentation on hybrid threats during CCOE seminar on hybrid threats back in October 2021. I definitely recommend going back to that for anybody who wasn't there. But he noted the importance of not militarizing phenomena that he described as actually much broader and more complex. And I think for cybersecurity, it's especially crucial to keep that perspective in mind. Within a sort of narrow definition of warfare, in fact, as noted in previous slides, there's quite a lot of uncertainty regarding what capabilities in cyberspace might look like, or really how effective they might be. On the other hand, there's plenty of activity in cyberspace that really defies comfortable or clean categorization as warfare, that has sort of considerable strategic impact, as well as an impact on overall sort of social or societal resilience. The examples I've laid out here are sort of economic espionage, IP theft, financially motivated disruptive activity, so again, notably ransomware. And in fact, in some cases, there's a discernible impact on the conduct of warfare elsewhere that derives from this sort of cybersecurity activity beyond the classical remit of warfare. So technical espionage can alter the balance of force capabilities, and of course, ransomware doesn't need to be warfare to pose a persistent risk for warfighting capabilities. So turning it around, there's an argument to be made, in fact, that cybersecurity beyond warfare has the potential to exert a considerable impact on warfare other than cybersecurity. Next slide, please. And secondly, this is perhaps a slightly more academic point, but beyond the usual differentiation between hybrid warfare and the more general concept of hybrid threats, there's an argument to be made that cybersecurity and phenomena in cybersecurity don't always fit the idea of a coherent threat. And this has a direct bearing on how one might best respond to issues in cyberspace. At one level, obviously, this pertains to the attribution dilemma. This is, as has already been discussed, not new territory for hybrid threats, but it definitely bears repeating. Attribution is a very particular consideration for cybersecurity. It's very much not guaranteed that the parties responsible for malicious activity or their intentions can be clearly identified and incorporated into policy responses. But going a little bit further than that and back to the notion of an ecosystem, I think it's important to know that many sort of key categories and cases of incidents and issues in cyberspace can't really be classed comfortably as a coherent threat. So I've already laid out the issue of sort of ransomware as being driven more by community and business models and financial motivations than any sort of individual actors or actor clusters. And so operator arrests will have an impact, but the technical hurdle of entering this field is low. And so really what you're looking at is a socioeconomic phenomenon. Directly tackling actors might arguably have a negligible effect. And I think we've seen that borne out over the course of the last few years. That's not to say that tackling the actors themselves doesn't have an impact, but we do need to be a little bit more circumspect. And again, looking at espionage, for example, the problem of it's not being centrally tasked rears its head again. If we look at issues such as decentralized contractors opportunistically targeting vulnerable internet-facing services before patching, this is very much not a case of sort of actors operating on behalf of clearly defined campaigns run by sort of identifiable actors. So there's really no guarantee that a straightforward threat or coherent intention can be identified, but threat will still be posed. From a response standpoint, what that means is that there's a need to shift away from simple sort of concepts of adversary targeting to look at, say, broader problems of architectures or infrastructures that sustain malicious activity. So really the conclusion here, cybersecurity lives and breathes hybridity, but I would say it's a mistake to just subsume it under the overall category of hybrid threats. It's a very narrow framing for a broad challenge. The two interface actively, as we've seen, but we do need to be somewhat more circumspect. Next slide, please. Fantastic, thank you. So on to the next section. How does this hybridity fuel cybersecurity ecosystem factor into resilience thinking? Next slide. Again, I'll start with a thoroughly unsurprising contention, which is that cyberspace and cybersecurity is integral to societal resilience. Cybersecurity is as important as it is because of the critical role played by cyberspace. I think we saw this illustrated amply in the previous presentation as well, but it's also reflected in, say, the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's designation of 16 critical infrastructure sectors, which it has done because these sectors are threatened by cybersecurity issues. And you can look at the 7 baseline requirements for national resilience that were laid out in the 2016 Warsaw Summit, and from there extrapolate fairly comfortably how it is that these sort of requirements are challenged by cybersecurity risks. I won't go through all of them individually, but I'd like to focus on 3 notable requirements here. Food and water, casualty handling, and transportation systems, all of which were impacted prominently in events over the course of the last year. As far as food and water resources are concerned, I'd like to look back quickly at the Revil ransomware incident at JBS. So this was a major meat processing firm that was targeted by a ransomware incident last year that led to disruptions in multiple countries. This was a clear indicator that really food production nodes are very much vulnerable to disruption, even by sort of what you might consider low-level activity. Mass casualties, again, very much impacted by ransomware. And last year and beyond that, over the course of the pandemic, this has been made abundantly clear. Beyond the individual targeting of sort of hospitals and clinics, the Conti ransomware incident targeting the Irish Health Service last year showed the potential impact of the direct targeting of national health services as a crucial service provision node. And of course, healthcare is fed by a supply chain of very much internet-facing service and product providers, such as was mentioned in the previous presentation, Fresenius here in Europe. And finally, transportation systems resilience. There have been recent cases in Iran and Belarus, in fact, that I would highlight. So that would be the Meteor Express wiper case in July last year and the Cyber Partisans incident last month, respectively, both targeting national railway firms. I would also contend, however, that conversely, it's important not to make too much of this. From a technical standpoint, sort of jumping from temporary disruption to something more long-lived or disruptive is a fairly sort of large jump to make. And you see that really in the sort of technical nitty-gritty of some of the incidents that have been publicly disclosed and that we know more about. Next slide, please. Quickly turning the last slide around, I think it's also critical to understand that resilience thinking and planning is crucial to cybersecurity today. There is a classic formulation that I'm sure everybody here has heard some variation of, this idea that defenders need to succeed all of the time, but attackers only need to succeed once. And this is increasingly subject to questioning. It's actually extremely difficult to sort of prevent initial intrusions 100% of the time. There are always sort of flaws or vulnerabilities or exposures that you are not aware of, that you have not put in your inventory. And so increasingly the understanding is that it's an equally important task to complicate actions by adversaries after intrusion and to ensure that the CIA triad, so that's confidentiality, integrity, and availability of services, can be maintained to an acceptable degree during and after an incident. And so really, I think it's important to sort of shift one's understanding of thinking surrounding cybersecurity and understand how crucial sort of resilience is to this. It can't be assumed that there is such a thing as an ironclad cybersecurity setup that prevents intrusions all of the time. It has to be assumed that compromises happen. And obviously, this factors fairly heavily into the role that cybersecurity plays in resilience planning overall at a social level. Next slide, please. It works both ways. Cybersecurity is central to societal resilience planning, and then vice versa, resilience thinking is central to cybersecurity. So what messages or lessons should we draw from this? Again, this isn't exhaustive, but I'd like to sort of put forward 2 suggestions, 2 points. Firstly, I think the point concerning communication and education surrounding cybersecurity is incredibly important. Obviously, the point I'm not trying to make here is that we cannot do anything about intrusions. Of course, every intrusion is a learning experience, and we should, of course, do everything we can to prevent them. But not every intrusion is a sort of catastrophe, nor is it a norm-violating crisis. And this feeds, I think, in fairly important ways into things such as the social communication of cybersecurity incidents or the conduct of cybersecurity diplomacy. And secondly, I think the failure to properly put incidents into context and to properly educate public audiences about what cybersecurity is and how it works can sort of generally increase the fear factor surrounding cybersecurity in a general social sense, with clear consequences for things such as communication in crisis contexts. Secondly, so if we shift from this idea that cybersecurity is meant to prevent intrusion all of the time to this idea that cybersecurity is more about what happens after an intrusion rather than before one, or not more, but equally, there's a need to understand much more in the cybersecurity context. So things like inventories or connections to other organizations or software and tooling dependencies. So what do certain assets and systems do? What do you have within your environment? What are the implications of an intrusion? What needs to be protected and kept running? What are the software dependencies that can't be overlooked, so that when sort of organization A is compromised, you know what the knock-on effect for other sort of critical service providers in the social context are. There's a need to sort of understand the current landscape in a much more comprehensive sense, but also plan and wargame for how resilience will function after the intrusion. And there are very good examples of this, such as I think the now discontinued, in fact, Plum Island electrical grid security exercises that were run in the US, I think, under the direction of DARPA. If you look at sort of the detailing of more recent iterations of those exercises, what you saw was that a lot of it focused on what happens after the initial intrusion. So how do you as a grid operator tackle sort of malicious actors in your networks? How do you keep sort of critical services running? And that's the sort of thinking I think that's essential to both sort of cybersecurity within the context of social resilience, but resilience thinking in cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for your patience. This is the long prophesied final section. As a quick caveat, I'm definitely not claiming that I have the solution to cybersecurity. I don't want to make myself redundant. But having left the audience today with massive intractable problems in the last few slides, what I'd like to do is extend the basic courtesy of at least trying to propose some solutions or approaches to solutions. So what I've done in this section is really try and highlight three major considerations that I hope will feed into the discussion that comes afterwards. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the first one here is what I'd call the task distribution challenge, otherwise known as "this looks difficult, let's give it to the military." I think this audience is better suited than most to understanding what this is and what the implications are. It's a very common response, maybe something to do with the fact that security isn't the term, cybersecurity, but it leads to, for example, the US debate surrounding the relationship between ransomware and cyber command. And so what we go from is this idea of ransomware as a problem, where is the military, to this lawfare headline, cyber command is in the ransomware game, now what? And there's some major pitfalls surrounding this that require, I think, active consideration. Obviously, because of this ecosystem perspective, because of the way cybersecurity works as a field, as a dilemma, there are major questions surrounding whether the military is the right organization for the job, or whether there are other stakeholders that should be, at the very least, the lead organizations in tackling certain problems. The second is the job clearly bounded and defined. This has clear sort of capacity and maybe legal implications that need to be understood. But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, does retasking military assets and capabilities detract from the core missions of military entities in cyberspace? And I think this is where CIMIC becomes sort of particularly important, as sort of civil-military cooperation allows an effective input of military capability and expertise without sort of forcing military entities to sort of take on additional tasks and maybe dilute their core missions in cyberspace. And obviously has a sort of benefit in turn in the reverse direction, sort of providing multi-stakeholder input from civil society into military cybersecurity efforts. So one sort of perspective that I think is particularly important, particularly for the present audience. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here, the second issue, sort of how one should tackle hybridity. So cybersecurity is an incredibly diversely populated ecosystem, and this applies not only to malicious actors, as we've mostly explored, but also stakeholders and victims or potential targets. It doesn't come as a surprise, of course, that the private sector's influence is considerable in the sphere. And I, as a case in point, I've put forward this following and very recent headline. So helping users stay safe, blocking internet macros by default in Office, a statement by Microsoft, a change that I think is meant to be implemented from April onwards. This is a very, very dry headline, but it tackles perhaps one of the most prolific initial intrusion vectors into victim networks that we've seen over the course of the last last decade at the very least, if not longer. Perhaps I'm too young to tell. Thankfully, we have longer standing experts here as well. But it's a very dry and technical headline, and yet I think it's fair to say that the impact of this single decision is likelier to far exceed sort of any single retaliatory action against malicious activity in cyberspace. This is a question of changing the terrain rather than fighting adversaries on their terrain. And so it's clear here, you know, as of 2022, the situation has not changed. Private sector influence is enormous. But there are many additional stakeholders that need to be taken into account, both consulted and protected, whether that's sort of smaller enterprises playing a critical role in supply chains or infrastructure maintenance, or non-profit entities involved in things like open source development or advocacy, or maybe under-resourced local government entities maintaining critical infrastructure. Far from an exhaustive list. Of course, there are other perspectives too, the difference between sort of local and national and international organizations that needs to be taken into account. But really any meaningful approach to cybersecurity in light of the hybridity of cybersecurity as a phenomenon has to take into account really the sheer scale of actors involved in this field. And next slide, please. And this is a final point. Information sharing, you see this a lot in sort of high-level recommendations for policy responses to cybersecurity. It's very good in theory. I don't think anybody disagrees that information sharing and cooperation are good things. It's very easy to say. It's much harder to think through what this might look like. So I've laid out just some general questions that should be taken into account here. What is the target beneficiary? Depending on who is meant to benefit from an information sharing or cooperation scheme, things will look different. The configuration looks different. The involved actors look different. This has to be taken into consideration. The purpose of the cooperation arrangement, if it's a sort of highly abstracted management level discussion forum, that's one thing. But if we're looking at something like a day-to-day and tactically oriented cooperative arrangement framework between organizations, it requires sort of something that is usable as part of a day-to-day security workflow. And feeding into that, there's the obvious question of whether an arrangement is efficient enough. So, for example, a very sort of common sharing option that you see is the sharing of technical indicators, especially sensitive ones between organizations. Obviously, this is a good thing, but if the sharing process is overly inefficient and too time-consuming, the indicators themselves actually diminish in utility, and so you then have to consider whether your current arrangement is efficient enough for the objectives that you want to meet. So it's good to share information, it's good to cooperate. Let's maybe think a little bit more about what that actually looks like in practice. And next slide, please. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your time. Again, it's been a pleasure and an honor, and I'm very much looking forward to the next presentation and the discussion after that.